Hey everyone, Ezekiel here with Deep Belonging. I'm here with my dear friend Nathan, and we're going to talk to you a little bit today about a program that we are offering together that's coming up next month in June. So before we dive in, I just want to have Nathan introduce himself a little bit. Take it away, Nathan.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, feeling a lot of gratitude to be here. Thank you all for tuning in. My name's Nathan Kwan Olmeyer. Tuning in from Southern Pomo and Coast Miwok land out here in Sebastopol, California. Very excited to be coming out to Virginia and help run this program with Ezekiel of Courting the Wild Depths. Little bit about me. My ancestry hails from the islands of Panay and Cebu, the Philippine archipelago, as well as the British Isles and Azores of Western Europe. So a long line of island-dwelling ancestors. Very excited to be here. Very excited to be here.
Thanks, Nathan. So Nathan's going to be traveling all the way out here to Virginia, which is where I am here on Tutelo land in Floyd County, Virginia, up in the high mountain plateau of the Southern Appalachians. As you can tell, I have mostly white ancestors that have been here on Turtle Island for a couple hundred years mostly. And prior to that, my ancestors are mostly from England, Scotland, and Scandinavia. So let's jump into talking about this program, Nathan. I want to just speak a little bit to the genesis of our collaboration, where it started, and then we can get into some specifics. But just want to tell a little bit about how we met and why we're doing this program together. And feel free to jump in at any time as I'm going along here. So Nathan and I have these two overlapping shared things, and they're both really, really central to my life. So the first one is a mutual friend, our dear friend Jesse, who we know very separately. I met Jesse in Guatemala and we became best friends. And you met Jesse through your work at Wilderness Awareness School. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Cool. Where Jesse is still an instructor. So that was kind of this first point of contact. And then Nathan and I are also both in the same graduate school program. It's called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. And Nathan was actually in a class that I was helping to teach. I was a teaching assistant for, called Nature and Eros. And from the first time that I was on a call with Nathan, I knew that there was something about this guy that I felt really intrigued by and wanted to know more about. And we had a really great conversation right off the bat. And then we continued to talk and found ourselves, spending hours upon hours on the phone. And eventually it kind of emerged when we realized, the extent to which we had shared interests around working with people on the land, supporting people to reconnect with the land. I think I put it out pretty early on in our relationship, Nathan. I was like, I know this is like, maybe it's even the first conversation where I was like, I know we should probably go on a date or something first, but I kind of want to collaborate with you in some way. So it feels so exciting to actually finally be making this a reality. Anything else you want to say about about PCC, our graduate school program, or kind of what brings you here?
I'm really grateful to you for rekindling that story and sharing that short version of that story of how we came into connection with one another. And there's a layer here too of even like the name of that program that you were helping to facilitate, and that I was a student inside of Nature and Eros, like love and the natural world. And I think that was definitely like a mutual point of connection, which is an loveness with the natural world, and like helping facilitate experiences to guide others to fall in love with the wild ones. And that just feels like a perfect segue of like falling in love with the wild world. And now here we are with the program of courting the wild depths, of like engaging in that courtship dance with our wild kin.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the question that I'd love to explore, we settled on this name of Courting the Wild Depths for this program. which is a 3-day land-based retreat. And I'm wondering, if you could speak just a little bit about why that name and what that means to you, and then maybe I can do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Yeah, there's a layer for me here of speaking to, on one hand, like the name of this program or the name of this organization of Deep Belonging, and then in particular with this, the name of this program of Courting the Wild Depths. And there's an acknowledgement of that courtship dance between engaging with ourselves, with our communities, the earth, and the cosmos is an incredibly ancient story. Something that's really stuck with me from that Nature and Eros program was when Brian Swim was speaking to allurement as like a foundational quality of the universe, and how even the universe began with two hydrogen atoms engaging in a dance of allurement, of courting one another. And then from those two hydrogen atoms, fast forward 14 billion years, and now we have us, this land, these oaks behind me, the fields and trees that are surrounding you. And it all rose from a courtship dance, and that this is like an ancient archetype. It's an ancient force of like courting and stepping into allurement with our wild kin. And so there's a layer here of this, we are re-engaging and stepping back inside this ancient archetype of courting the wild depths of ourselves, our own internal landscapes, our external landscapes, the internal landscape of the earth, and then the internal landscape of the cosmos, and all of our wild kin who are present with us inside that journey.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the name Deep Belonging for this organization really emerged. It actually came out of a dream that I had, but the resonance there for me, or the significance for me, is really the sense that for me in my own journey and in many of the people that I've worked with, there's this feeling of estrangement, this feeling of like, I don't belong in the context of the natural world. I'm maybe part of this human economy, or maybe this family, or maybe this small social group, but it's been profoundly important for me to discover what it means to actually belong to the earth and to belong in the cosmos, to feel myself as an integral part of this universe process, and to feel myself as an integral member of the earth community. So that's really where Deep Belonging comes from. And this idea of courting the wild depths, which is what we've named this program, it's really about finding our way back into relationship with the depths of the living world, the world outside of us, but also the depths of the inner world. And that there's a way in which this courtship, this romance, is actually required in order to feel a sense of belonging, in order to feel a sense of connection, that we can't just think about it. We can't just have an idea that we're connected, but we actually have to have embodied experiences and use our imagination to find our way into a living relationship with the world.
Beautiful. And that actually that sparks for me this acknowledgement too of, like as we open ourselves to engage in a courtship with wildness, there's also a layer of like wildness opens up to court us too, and it's like a reciprocal relationship. And it reminds me of a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, and I don't have it down to par, so this is going to be a slight paraphrase, where she speaks to how like being in love with the world is a really beautiful thing, but then there's that moment where you find yourself like experiencing the world being in love with you, and just the openness and just how the depth of expansion that comes with that mutual love between self and place. And truly, like the courtship dance, as we engage in this courtship dance of courting the wild depths, there's a layer of like the reciprocity there. As we open ourselves up to the world itself opens itself to us.
Maybe we can speak a little bit to why someone would want to sign up for this program and what they might get out of it. You want to have a go at that?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a yeah, there's a layer here to acknowledge how born into cosmologies that are dominated by the Western mind, we have inherited cosmologies of separation, that the human is somehow separate from the rest of the living world. And in fact, like, even that separation was born out of a sense that the rest of the world is dead, and that we are the only alive and living beings, and the rest of the world is like meant for us and our use. Coming back to the Cartesian split of Rene Descartes. And this inheritance that we have been given as we were born into this world is a false dichotomy, and inspires feelings of separateness and isolation. And while there's this acknowledgement that separation is like born of this idea of the rest of the world as being separate from us, when we untether ourselves from the world and when we uproot ourselves from the living land, we actually create a separation inside of ourselves, one that needs tending and healing, as we engage, as we continue to engage. And so there's a need here to courting the wildness, and courting the living world is in itself actually like a process of courting ourselves, and an acknowledgement that's belonging to place, belonging to our communities, belonging to the earth and cosmos, is one of the depth of gifts of being a live, living person. And it's a gift that we were not given, or not, I don't want to say that's a very generalized term, but there are many of us, we were not given that when we were born into this world. And there's a layer here of reclaiming that relationship, by engaging in a courtship dance, and the courtship dance of engaging in these embodied practices of terrapsychology, embodied dream work, myth tending, wildcrafting, ecological story catching. Like, these are all pathways to reconnect with ourselves, our communities, earth and cosmos. And there is a need for this as we are engaging in the time of climate collapse and all of the various crises that are plaguing our communities. There's an acknowledgement here that this work of courtship and courting the wild depths is the long-term vision. For as we continue to engage in renewable energies and engage in social justice and all of these things that are absolutely necessary, there's an acknowledgement that long-standing change there's a need to reclaim our right relations with the living world. And right relations not as in RIGHT, but right relations as RITE. Like, what is sacred to us and sacred in our relationships to the more than human world.
Yeah, thank you for that. I resonate with everything that you spoke to. And I think that, for me, what I would say around someone, like, why would someone want to do this program and what might they want to get out of it? I think that, just as you were saying, Nathan, most of us who have been born into Western culture have not been given the skills or the perspectives that enable us to feel ourselves a part of the living web of life. We're basically, our minds are trained, our senses are trained to feel that sense of separateness, to feel that sense of, our value is tied to our productivity. The living world exists to be transformed into stuff for our consumption. There is no meaning to the world. It's just one big mechanism that's sort of slowly running down. And this vision of a meaningless materialistic universe, to me, is just ultimately unfulfilling. And so I know that so many people today find themselves in jobs that are not fulfilling. They find themselves in social situations that feel too small and that do not call on these larger conversations about meaning and purpose and belonging and connection. And so, and we're also just overworked. typical American work week is insane. It doesn't really provide a lot of space to do anything but survive. And so taking a retreat, while yes, on the one hand, it's a sort of luxurious thing of privilege, it's also, I think, a really necessary disruption of the pattern of productivity that allows us to slow down and reattune to the rhythms of the natural world. And just doing that alone, I mean, just slowing down and waking with bird song, falling asleep under the stars, sitting around a campfire, sitting by a stream, just doing these simple acts in many ways is enough. And putting these things together with intention, with community, with strong facilitation, with ritual, this retreat really is an opportunity to start or continue to stitch ourselves back into the fabric of reality.
Yeah, absolutely. That resonates so much with me, Easy. And there's like a layer here too for me, rising with what you were speaking to, is like there's this acknowledgement of that split that happened between human and the more than human world, was done to enhance and make superior the human to all the rest of the living world. And I think in my own sense of like one of the unintended consequences of that Cartesian split was to separate the human story outside of the story of the living world, to separate the human culture outside of the cultures of the rest of the living world, and to separate the human myth outside of the myth of the living world. And so a part of this work of Courting the Wild Depths is like the reweaving of the human back inside the earth story, back inside earth culture, and back inside earth myth, to re-engage in a holistic wildness with all of our wild kin.
Yeah, so maybe we can speak a little bit about the elements of this program, what we're actually going to be offering. We've spoken a little bit throughout our conversation here, but yeah, maybe we can speak a little more depth around what we're going to actually be offering.
Awesome.
So the first thing that I'll speak to, and we can just kind of go back and forth, is dream work. And it's one of the things that I love most about facilitating retreats is having quiet time in the morning when we wake up, and then holding silence until we gather in circle and delve into dreams. And the way that I like to work with dreams is really an embodied approach. It's not about analyzing dreams. It's not about mining them for meaning. It's about really using the imagination to re-engage and re-enter the dream world, and being in relationship with the images that arise from the unconscious. And what I can say about the dream work is that it's an opportunity for us to make contact with parts of ourselves that otherwise we're sort of blind to. They remain in the unconscious, but the dream is sort of this opportunity to say like, oh, something's trying to get my attention. What is it?
Yeah, a connection there to me of like curiosities around, because one of the other core elements of this program is myth tending. And I'm curious if there's a connection for you between dream work and myth tending, and if you also would like to speak to myth tending a little more.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Generally, I think we have lost the mythic dimension of our understanding of ourself. And it's not, I don't think that it's that we've actually lost it. I think that we have just literalized it and turned it into something that is very concrete and that loses touch with the archetypal powers that we hear about in old myths, old stories. And so part of the work of tending to our dreams is really about discovering what is the myth of my life, and how is that myth, how is the myth emerging through me? It's not about, how am I consciously creating this myth as though we were in total control of our destiny and our story, but how am I tuning into this myth that is happening through me, and how am I participating in this myth that is emerging. So yeah, I think the practice of dream work and the art of myth tending are intimately related. I think that we each of us have a responsibility to discover and inhabit the myth that is our life. The other thing that I want to speak to is around imagination, and it's one element that has been very surprising to me in my journey of reconnecting. And really what it boils down to is this recognition that the imagination is not just this frivolous thing that we do when we're daydreaming, but that actually the imagination is an organ of perception. The imagination is a way in which we can make contact with our own inner depths, but also make contact with the world outside of us. And so just as an example of that, one of my teachers, Janine Marie Hogan, she talks about this practice of acting as if. And what she means by that is basically disrupting our habituated way of seeing and engaging with the world. So when you're on the land, instead of just walking by trees, as though they were these dead objects that are just so much material waiting to be processed, acting as if the tree is aware of your presence. That's an imaginative act. It requires us to say, like, what does it mean to be a tree? What does it mean to be a tree aware of me? Who knows? Like, we don't really have answers to those questions. If we can recognize that there's an interiority, an inner presence for a tree, for a bird, for any living creature, if we can recognize that interiority and act as if my interiority could make contact with that interiority, then we start to get a sense of, what is it to be in relationship with the world, not just externally, but internally, to be in relationship as an interior with another interior. And I think we have to have imagination in order to do that. So
absolutely. And there's like a layer for me that's bubbling up in the as like this interior is engaging with this interior. We're also inside another interior, like, of this land. And so even like us, like, imaginal conversations that I'm engaging, as in that example of with that tree, like, are also inside the interior and the imagination of Earth, engaging in that process together. That's really beautiful. Thank you, Easy.
Yeah, thanks for that expansion of the scope there. Yeah, so I'm curious, Nathan, to hear you speak a little bit about ecological story catching and what that means to you. And
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So a little bit of context for this. Ecological story catching, like, that terminology is a terminology that came to me actually pretty recently, within the last few weeks. And it was a way for me of, like, doing a catch-all for the ways in which I engage the wild world. A number of years ago, I attended a school where I studied tracking and bird language, ethnobotany, permaculture design, and things of that nature. And as the years have passed and my relationship with the world has gone deeper into various landscapes, there's been this acknowledgement for me, like, as I am tracking an animal, or as I'm listening to the bird song, or as I'm witnessing the flowering of a plant, like, there's an acknowledgement that these are all stories that are being told. And this framework for me is really important, because one of the aspects that the modern Western mind uses to separate humans from the rest of the world is this idea that only humans are storytellers. But to reimagine, like, the wild world as being full of storytellers, all who are telling and sharing their stories, and that if we are in tuned enough to our senses, to different naturalist studies, we can actually catch the stories that they are telling. An example of this is just the other day, I was walking down a trail down here behind where I'm living in this moment. And as I was walking down the trail, all of a sudden I witnessed a little California towhee, who's a small little sparrow species, flitter up onto a wood post and then begin to alarm. And they were sending off this call, and their body was stiff and they were stressed, and they were just like alarming in this very specific direction. And as I turned and looked in that direction, I started to just have a curiosity, like, who is it you're alarming at? Who is it that you're warning the rest of your kin about that's in this landscape? And as I turned my head and looked in the direction that they were pointing in, all of a sudden a great horned owl came flying out of an oak tree and then landed at the top of an apple tree. And they were sitting there, and it was also, this moment happened to be during the dusk and sunset. So now this owl is just silhouetted black against an orange, pink, and red sky behind them. And as they're sitting up upon this apple tree, I hear a crow call come over my right shoulder. Now this crow comes flying down and comes in and starts to barrage this owl upon this tree, warning everyone that this owl is here and conversing with the land and telling a story about the presence of this owl. And through my relationship and understanding of bird language, I was able to recognize that there was a predator's presence in this landscape. And then by attuning myself to the story that that California towhee was sharing, I could see and then witness this great horned owl and then step inside a relationship with this owl. And so this story, this ecological story catching that really flows through in bird language tracking and ethnobotany, and geology. I don't want to leave out geology, actually. There's an acknowledgement that we can deepen and enhance our own stories by coming into relationship with the stories of the living land. This other aspect that comes in with ecological storytelling that I'm feeling called to speak to is one of the foundations of the cosmology of separation dwells inside of our language and how we speak about the world and about ourselves. And there's this acknowledgement that the English language is full of nouns. So we see the world as being these stagnant objects that are just in place and are who they are. But inside an indigenous context, or just contexts that are not of the Western mind, there's an acknowledgement that beings are verbs. There are some languages where, like, the name for a river translates to being a river, and an acknowledgement that the river is a living entity who is weaving stories as they're flowing. And so to come into relationship with the world as all of these beings surrounding us as living stories who are sharing and telling their stories, we can then know ourselves as a process and know ourselves as being a living verb coming into relationship with the wider world. And understanding them as storytellers and also story catchers, we then too can become storytellers and story catchers of a living landscape. And that kind of like actually leads me into wildcrafting, this acknowledgement of, tracking bird language, those skills. I'm catching and attuning myself to the storytellers of place. And wildcrafting is this experience of weaving stories together. I have this, I really enjoy both basket weaving and woodworking and carving. And there's this acknowledgement for me of, like, basket weaving is an incredible example of this mutual storytelling, that process that unfolds. Like, as I go out into the land and I harvest willow, me, 1 + 1, other one being willow, is just this human now who has this bundle of willow. But to engage in that process of transmutation is that 1 + 1, me plus a willow, now creates a basket, an entirely third entity that neither of us alone could create and by ourselves. And that it's not just an equation of 1 + 1 = 2. It's a 1 + 1 = 3 because of this third component that has risen out of this alchemical process. And that dialogical piece of this parapsychological quality is an acknowledgement that the alchemical process comes through a conversation. Any basket weaver and any carver or any wild crafter can tell you that they do not have full control over the process. That a part of the process is listening to the willow as you're weaving the willow. You cannot make the willow do what it does not want to do. And if you try, you're going to snap your willow wisp. And so there has to be this component of mutual listening. As you're listening to the willow is also listening to you, and you engage in this process of creating the basket. Another example in a kind of slightly different context would be woodworking and carving. Before I engage in a woodworking process, like I'll go and do a sit spot with the piece of wood, and I'll just sit with them for an extended period of time in a wild place. And I'll just listen to the piece of wood and start to use my imagination to visualize who the wood wants to become, who it is that they're wanting to be. And there's almost this aspect of like their imagination is also penetrating me. And we're imagining together of like who we are going to become together. And anytime I ever engage in a process of wood carving, there's always this deep felt sense of like, as I'm carving the wood to like carve that owl or to carve that fish hook or what have you, I also deeply feel myself being carved, and that I am also having wood shaved away from my own body, and my own inner self is becoming more and more fully realized, just as the wood's inner self is becoming more and more fully realized through that process of dialogical alchemy that is an intrinsic quality inside wildcrafting. And so there's this layer here of like inviting wildcrafting into this program is to engage in, it's this way of attuning ourselves to be in conversation with the beings that surround us, and a way of uplifting those conversations and bringing them to exist both in the imaginal and the actual.
I really appreciate everything you said, Nathan. The focus on language and the need for better language to really help us find our way back into right relationship with the living world. I feel like, there's this sense in the context of what you're just saying around, there's tree and then there's human as like these separate things, but that's actually somewhat illusory, because actually there's tree becoming human as this process, and there's human becoming tree as this process. And that's ultimately true for everything that we're in relationship with, right? I mean, there's this real sense that there's a growing together that's happening that leads to the kind of transmutation that you're talking about. And that I really believe that that's what, cultivating connection is about. That's what courting the wild depths is about. It's about tending to these fibers that we share with the world, and strengthening those fibers through our conscious attention. We should probably wrap it up. I want to say in closing, thank you for taking the time, Nathan, to talk with me, and thanks to all of you folks out there. If you're still with us at this point, thanks for hanging in there. So Courting the Wild Depths is going to be held Friday through Sunday, June 17th through 19th in Montgomery County on Monacan land in Jefferson National Forest. Nathan is coming all the way from California to be with us, bringing his incredible gifts of intelligence and embodied wisdom to share. And yeah, if you have any questions, like I said, please reach out. Yeah. Any last words, Nathan?
I just want to name, gratitude to you, Easy. And also I am so excited for this program. There's a lot of layers and movement that will happen. I get that sense. There will be a much emergence and wildness inside this program. And I'm looking forward to coming out to Virginia, coming out to that land, connecting with any of you who are interested in participating, and may we court the wild depths together.
Thanks, brother.
Thanks, Easy.